Of the speeches that we are considering in this series of case studies, this one is pretty clearly closest to what the class is about because Roosevelt dictated the first draft of the Day of Infamy speech pretty much out of his head, and Barbara Jordan didn't use a speechwriter. She wrote her keynote speech herself. For both of those speeches, we have the advantage of the intermediate drafts so that we can get a look at what does the tinkering and the fine-tuning process look like. But this one, which we've left for last, this was done by a team of speechwriters. Reagan did not have his hands on any of these drafts. I remember I was a junior in high school the day the Challenger exploded about just a little over a minute off the launch pad, and there were a whole lot of school children who watched it happen because that lady there on the left, that's Krista McAuliffe, and she was a grade school science teacher. And so what she was planning on doing was she was going to teach a science class, and it was going to be televised live from orbit. So we had never up until then had such a major catastrophe in the space program. We'd never had a mid-air disaster. We look back now, and 2 space shuttles have broken up while in the air, but on that day there'd never even been one, which meant that it wasn't thinkable really yet. This was also, by the way, the day of the State of the Union address. By tradition, the day that the president gives the State of the Union, the White House invites reporters to come to the White House for a luncheon. So at 11:38 a.m., the launch happened, and 1 minute and 13 seconds later, it exploded. Reagan was at the luncheon with the reporters, but his vice president, the elder George Bush, and the national security advisor, John Poindexter, saw the explosion live and told the president. He watched it on replay, and the luncheon was canceled. Peggy Noonan, who was the principal speechwriter on this speech, she had pretty much the same experience as Reagan. She wasn't watching it, she was working, but she was called over to watch it on the replay, and at 1 p.m., Reagan convened a press conference. He said that this was the first in-flight explosion in NASA history. He said NASA had his full confidence. He said his thoughts went to the spouses and families of the astronauts. One of the reporters asked, "What about the one volunteer on board?" And Reagan corrected the reporter, "They're all volunteers. They're all citizens. This is the final frontier." Another reporter asked him, what would he tell all the children who were watching? And he said, "I'd make it plain to them that life does go on, and you don't back up and quit some worthwhile endeavor just because you've had a tragedy." Now, in the Reagan White House, they typically spent 6 or 7 days on even a minor speech. For major addresses, they would do 10 days to 2 weeks. This one they popped out in 6 hours. Noonan wrote it with some edits from her boss, Ben Elliott, and input from 3 or 4 other staffers. And in particular, there was one staff writer for the National Security Council that made some truly awful edits, including one that I'll show you when we get to the first draft, which actually we're to the point where we can get to the first draft now. Let me tell you about the really awful edit. Jump down to the very bottom. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning, as they prepared for their journey, waved goodbye, and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. Now that's from a poem. It's a poem called High Flight. The entire poem is beautiful. But this staffer from the National Security Council, wait, I have to set this up. Back in the 1980s, there was a lot of money being made by telephone companies, but it wasn't like today. They weren't selling cell phones. Cell phones mostly didn't exist yet. The only people who had cell phones were reporters, the military, and the occasional drug dealer, and they were so huge you had to carry this massive heavy briefcase around just for all the electronics. So the phone companies were making money off selling long-distance service because you still had to pay a bill every month just for your long-distance phone calls. And one of the phone companies, I think it was Southwestern Bell, their jingle, their song, the lyrics to it were "Reach out and touch someone." And if you were to go to YouTube right now, you could pull one of them up and you could hear that schmaltzy song, and you could probably see this coming. The NSC staffer lined out that last sentence in the draft of the speech and changed it to "They prepared for their journey and waved goodbye to reach out and touch someone." And Noonan said, "Absolutely not. If that edit stays in, I will walk out of the White House and I will never write another speech for the president." And the advisors looked at this edit in disbelief, and they restored her version. So to look more generally at this draft, and you can freeze the video and you can have a look at it. It's not particularly long, only half a page. It's got an expression of pain. It's got an acknowledgement of the risks of spaceflight. a tribute to the astronauts' courage, direct address to the families, and then the poetic ending. Those are the core elements that you're going to see through all the drafts of this speech. Reagan at first thought that the important thing to communicate to the nation was what he said to the press conference, life goes on. So his original plan was he was going to go ahead and give the State of the Union, but then he changed his mind. He canceled it and decided instead just to give brief remarks about the shuttle disaster. And so from this draft to the second draft, what he told the team he wanted was for the answers he gave the reporters at the press conference to get incorporated into the speech. Attention to children, the frontier analogy, the importance of not giving up, continuity, which meant that the speechwriting team was writing in his voice. He had already voiced those exact thoughts. They were just channeling him. So if you remember our discussion of ethics, this would be ethical speechwriting. He had already contributed the bulk of the ideas. He had even phrased them, and what the speechwriters were going to do was arrange them and put polish on them so that they could be delivered as a manuscripted speech. So let's have a look at the second draft. Now, the first thing that would not make it into the final draft, look at the third paragraph, the one that has lined out, we forget what courage, and look at that last sentence. But they, the Magnificent Seven, were aware of the dangers. And in the previous draft, they overcame whatever fears they had to do them. In this draft, it became they were aware of the dangers and overcame them and did their jobs brilliantly. And one of the speechwriters on the team, looking at this draft, said, "What do you mean they overcame the danger? They died." On the first draft, the team had been thinking about their priority was to unite the country. But what Reagan said to do on this draft then was to separate out two audiences and address them directly. To address children who were watching, and they knew that they had just watched a school teacher die, and they may never have considered before the people that they saw every day could actually die. And the other audience that Reagan wanted addressed was NASA. NASA may have felt after a catastrophe like this that they'd be under the gun, which meant that this was a crisis speech with direct remarks to two stakeholder groups. The frontier reference, by the way, is very, very much in Reagan's voice. It's very rustic, it's very optimistic. It also defines who is an American and what to do next, what the next thing ought to be. Now, the Drake story, if you look at the line near the bottom, there's a coincidence today. On this day 390 years ago, the great explorer Sir Francis Drake died aboard ship off the coast of Panama. In his lifetime, the great frontiers were the oceans, and a historian later said he lived by the sea, died on it, and was buried in it. Today we can say of the Challenger crew, they lived by space, died in it, and were buried in it. For their dedication was, like Drake's, complete. That was actually one of the speechwriters on the team was Pat Buchanan, who had a historian friend at Boston University who called up and told him, you realize this is the anniversary of Drake's death, and there's an illustration, there's a device you could use there, and Buchanan just jumped on it, thought it was going to be one of the best moments in the speech. You'll see that it got modified a little bit in the third draft, which, speaking of, let's have a look. Now, in that third paragraph, 19 years ago, almost to the day, we lost 3 astronauts in a terrible accident on the ground. That's Apollo 1. And some of the viewers were actually old enough to remember it. And when that happened, NASA had been accused of incompetence and mismanagement. And a major purpose of this speech was to protect the program. Now, it was tricky because, as we talked about, in talking about crisis speaking, you can't minimize. You can acknowledge for the purpose of deflecting, but you don't necessarily want to focus on the Apollo 1 explosion and the parallel between them. If you can say that 19 years have gone by, and then if you can go on later in the speech to affirm the agency and say that it has your confidence, that's probably the best that Reagan can do at that point. And look, about halfway down that paragraph, the Magnificent Seven finally becomes the Challenger 7. And they were aware of the dangers, but overcame them and did their jobs brilliantly. The changing from Magnificent Seven to Challenger 7, one of the speechwriters on the team pointed out that the Magnificent Seven were a bunch of drunk cowboys. And it's also the case that Reagan, because he was an actor, people were always making jokes and making fun of him for how obsessed he was with Hollywood and movies. So Challenger 7 was just going to suit his purposes a lot better than Magnificent 7, which would just stir up some more of the ridicule. So then, if you look down at the second to the bottom paragraph, I want to add that I wish I could talk to every man and woman who works for NASA who worked on this mission and tell them, your dedication and professionalism have moved and impressed us for decades, and we know of your anguish. And look what they lined out. But we're sure you did your best to ensure a safe and successful flight. That got changed to, we know of your anguish, we share it. The reason for that was the speechwriters realized we didn't yet know the cause. It might come out that they actually hadn't done their jobs. So the thing that Reagan was able to say at this point, without necessarily having to eat his words later on, was that the NASA engineers were obviously grief-stricken. Yes, so was everyone in the United States. And then finally, you'll notice near the bottom, today we can say of the Challenger crew, they lived by space, died in it, and were buried in it. That needed to come out. What they were left with, the quote about Drake was appropriate. Today we can say of the Challenger crew, their dedication was, like Drake's, complete. He can allude to the quote about Drake without making something that's honestly in kind of poor taste about the Challenger astronauts. So you should take a minute and you should watch Reagan give the Challenger eulogy. Up until this moment, this was the moment in the minds of a lot of people who study public address when the President of the United States became the mourner-in-chief. And you may have noticed, if you follow the news, that just about every time there's a really headline-grabbing mass shooting in the United States, the President of the United States is expected to show up to the memorial service and to speak to comfort the nation. Reagan more or less invented that role for the president with the giving of this speech because he was so good. He set the bar high, and all the presidents who followed him had to offer some kind of response when a traumatic event happened and the nation demanded a response. So that's another look into the process of how you move through drafts of speeches and how you tune the language. And so hopefully this is shedding some light on how this works, and you are all set up to take your quiz. And this will be the last of the quizzes. The light is at the end of the tunnel.